Hi guys, today's lesson is going to be on the crime scene. We're going to focus in on the general process of how a crime scene has worked, what happens at a crime scene, who's there, and then specifically we're going to look at what happens in forensic science related to that crime scene. So the phrase processing a crime scene, we see a lot of that in Hollywood, all the crime TV shows and movies, but ultimately they don't quite get the full grasp of it and let the viewer understand what goes on there. Often it's very flashy. Scenes are cut, so they only have the moment in which the investigator finds some crucial piece of evidence. But ultimately, we have a very long and tedious process that will involve purposeful documentation of the conditions at the scene, and of course, the collection of any of that physical evidence that could possibly illuminate what happened and point to who did it. So again, in Hollywood, we see these real short clips or a montage of clips of them working a crime scene, but in real life, this is a very long process. A lot of personnel can be required if the scene is large. It can take anywhere from a few hours to possibly a few days or a few weeks if the scope of the crime is very large. So the reality of it is going to be somewhat different than what we are typically used to seeing. Take a look at this scene for a moment. Try to look at it from an objective standpoint. Look around the room. Try to understand what you believe may have occurred at this place. There's a lot of details that are here in this crime scene that an astute investigator must be able to internalize and must be able to use their prior experience to perhaps find commonalities in this crime scene to things they've seen before. So just take a moment and look around the room, and then in a few moments what I'll do is I'll change the scene a little bit with a different view. Here's another view of that same scene. As you can tell, the camera angle is slightly different. Now you can see a little bit more of the room as it's taken from a position that's up higher in elevation, looking down upon that same scene. Again, take a look at it for a few moments and see if anything new pops into your head. Perhaps, where is this place? Are there any details here in what you see that make you believe you may know where this has occurred? What type of business might it be? What may have happened inside the little vestibule on the way to the outer doors and inside of this room? All of those things are going to have to be figured out as the team of investigators looks at all of these things that are present in the room and tries to determine the course of action, what took place at this crime scene. Some important questions that need to be answered, of course, for our purposes, is what actually is the crime scene itself? Is it just this room or is it more? Well, we can kind of break this down into a little bit more detail. For example, straightforwardly, the specific place where the crime occurred, and it appears that it has happened in this room, but it's not guaranteed because we see the blood trailing out the door. So the crime scene clearly at some point has moved from the inside to the outside. All paths of entry or exit. To get to a crime scene, the perpetrator had to take a specific path there, and to leave the crime scene, if they did leave the crime scene, how they exited and where that led to is the next secondary crime scene if this was the initial primary one. Any nearby area where evidence may have been moved or discarded. So perhaps if the perpetrator of whatever crime this was moving things around, discarding things they used during the perpetration of the crime itself, they're now enlarging that crime scene to a bigger area. So ultimately, you could have a centralized location of your crime scene, and then everywhere that perpetrator went to escape being caught now becomes secondary and tertiary crime scenes that also have to be investigated. So, who shows up to the crime scene? Who's there at the scene? Usually, when a crime is first committed, what will happen is nearby pedestrians and perhaps eyewitnesses will call the police, and ultimately, they're going to be usually the first that are going to arrive at that crime scene. If the perpetrator is still there, they're going to arrest that perpetrator. And if there are people who are injured, it could be the perpetrator, it could be victims, multiple victims at the crime scene. They will call for ambulance and medical services. They're going to be responsible for securing the scene so no evidence is destroyed. So pretty quickly, the police have to assess how big the crime scene is, and knowing that evidence is very fragile, they're going to have to secure that scene. They're going to get out the yellow tape and they're going to start stringing it along anywhere they believe that may have been part of that crime scene so no evidence gets destroyed or tampered with. After that's been done, your CSI unit, your crime scene investigation unit, is going to document the crime scene in detail and collect what physical evidence that they can. Another person that's going to show up is the district attorney, and they're there to determine if investigators require a search warrant to go further with their investigation. And if necessary, the district attorney will all go ahead and make that connection and get that warrant from a judge, so then the crime scene investigation can get in and do the job that they need to do. A medical examiner may be called if there's a homicide, and may or may not be present to determine the preliminary cause of death. So ultimately, they may show up to the crime scene if there are deceased victims, and they may also perhaps bring a body back to the coroner's office or the medical examiner's office and do their post-mortem work there. Specialists can be called in as well. Entomologists, which of course these are the forensic specialists who deal in bugs in time of death. Other types of forensic scientists, perhaps forensic psychologists, may be called in if the evidence would require those experts to be there. And also detectives are going to interview the witnesses who are present at the crime scene. Usually they're separated out and kind of led away from that scene, so what they saw isn't changed due to the power of suggestion of others. They're going to investigate the crime by ultimately following leads provided by the witnesses and the physical evidence that your forensic team is going to be looking for. So you can see there's clearly a teamwork effort to work a crime scene. All these people have a role to ultimately find the truth of what happened at a particular crime scene, try to figure things out, and they work together in order to do that. Let's look a little closer at some of those actions that do take place upon a crime being called in by witnesses, and see what happens in what order. So the first thing that's going to happen is police officers are going to approach the scene and they're going to define the extent of that crime scene, how big it is, if there's secondary crime scenes, paths that go in and out of the crime scene that also have to be taped off and secured. They want to make sure that the scene is secure and protected. They don't want people walking off with evidence that may be at a crime scene. Perhaps there's weapons laying around after a shootout, and some people who are just congregating to the crime scene are close enough where they may be able to take some of these items and weapons away from the crime scene. Clearly, we don't want that to happen because there's valuable evidence on those weapons and evidence that we don't want missing as we try to put together the facts of the case. Now, of course, these first two steps are going to be done by the police that show up. They're going to secure, they're going to close access to that crime scene, and they're going to protect that crime scene, deny access from anyone else from getting in there unless they're part of the team that's working that crime, and ultimately and keep anyone who could mess up the crime scene out. Again, they may have to enlarge the crime scene if they realize, some clues are telling them, hey, this person had this other route in that we thought. And now, the backyard becomes part of the crime scene, needs to be taped off, or an alleyway. There's a million different scenarios that could happen. So they're going to set up their yellow tape line. Do not cross it. Number 3, they will also identify, remove, and separate the witnesses from the crime. So they're going to do their best on the spot to determine who is a legitimate witness to it and try to keep them, again, away from others, because the power of suggestion could change their opinion if someone planted an idea in their head in the talk that happens after the crime's committed. Now, when the crime scene investigation team does show up, one of the things that they're going to have to do is clearly they're going to communicate with the police, so they're welcomed into the crime scene to begin working, and they're going to do what's known as an initial walkthrough. They're basically going to go in there with a real objective mindset and look around the crime scene and try to see what has happened. They're going to look in 3 dimensions. They're going to look high. They're going to look low. They're going to see, what is left on, if it's inside in a room, what sounds are there, what smells are there. They're going to use all their senses while trying to maintain the evidence at the scene and not contaminate it in any way. So that's their initial walkthrough. After this, of course, the human mind goes to complete pictures rather readily. So they're going to generate their initial theory based on that visual examination. If you work in the field, there's a good chance you have some wisdom based on a lot of the cases that you've seen in the past. And a lot of cases will resemble things that they have maybe seen before, and sometimes it's brand new as well. Sometimes they'll go to a crime scene and they've never seen anything like it before, so they recall on that prior experience to help them work through that crime scene. Still, nothing is touched yet at that crime scene. So while they're doing that walkthrough, they've kind of planned out a path that's going to be the safest path that will contain the least amount of evidence that would be destroyed by walking through it. So they're going to dodge as much as they can and try to pick a pathway that will be the least damaging to what may be there in the form of evidence and clues to solving the crime. They're going to take a lot of notes at this time, starting from the real general kind of stuff. What time is it? What's the weather like? Perhaps these conditions are going to change rather quickly, so they have to kind of have an expediency to it and work that crime scene as fast as they can. Maybe it's an outdoor scene and it's going to rain, or perhaps snow, or the wind is picking up and it could blow away something critical. You can see in the second cloud notable smells. Is there a gas smell, a decomposition smell, like something's dead? Is there any sounds going off at the crime scene? Water dripping, smoke alarms beeping, and things that seem to be out of place. We have ideas of what normalcy looks like, and we go into a crime scene and we're looking for things out of the ordinary. Some of the examples: is there a chair pushed up against the door underneath the doorknob? That would be kind of odd. If there's a bed and there's no pillows on it, clearly that's going to be something out of the ordinary. Not many people would sleep without a pillow. So where are those pillows? And pillows wind up being one of the things that people use to mop up blood because they're so readily available, and then they try to hide those pillows in pillowcases. Potential hazards are going to be looked for at this time. Gas leaks, perhaps someone was going to, try to burn up all the evidence. Maybe they wanted the house to explode, so all the evidence would be gone, obliterated. Maybe there's a dog that is guarding a dead body, a deceased person, and that's going to be an issue because the evidence could be clearly messed up by a dog that's being aggressive. And how are you going to get the dog out of there so you're not attacked, your personal safety? So there's a lot of things that have to go through your mind on the fly as you work these very fragile, temporary crime scenes. And so again, we mentioned that notes are going to be taken down as the investigator thinks through all this information. And When you're trying to be a scientific note taker and use all of your senses for observation, it takes some development. We're not always keyed in to things that stick out and seem abnormal. So we have past experience and we have life examples that kind of they change our mindset of what we interpret when we look at things. Whereas if you're trying to stay scientific, you keep all subjectiveness out of it and try to be as objective as possible. So if you look in the middle paragraph, it says, whereas a lay person may see a large brownish red stain on the carpet spreading outwards from a corpse, and write down blood spreading outward from underside of corpse. A crime scene investigator is going to change that a little bit and keep the subjectivity out of it. Instead, you can see a large brownish red fluid spreading outward from the underside of the corpse. This fluid might be blood, it might be decomposition fluid, which resembles blood at a certain stage. So ultimately, they're not going to make that determination yet until it's tested and gone through the scientific process to determine without a doubt that is blood. So generally, opinions don't matter when working a crime scene. Assumptions are harmful, especially when they're entered into the notes, because now it's part of the official record. So when inside these crime scenes, your CSIs are going to make factual observations without drawing any conclusions, if possible. So the written notes is definitely a big one. They keep forever. Once you write it down on a piece of paper, that piece of paper will last indefinitely. Number 2, audio notes. These can be digital recordings, maintaining audio recordings in chain of custody as evidence, and transcriptions and transcribing the information. So sometimes people will walk through with a little digital recorder, and they'll perhaps after their initial walkthrough, the second walkthrough, they're now dictating into the little digital recorder what they see, so they don't forget some of those key details that they find at that crime scene that don't make it into the notes. The third time through, they may actually start then combining the two as they start preparing their report. A chain of custody, and we'll get more into that a little bit later, is ultimately once we have identified a piece of information, a piece of evidence, that evidence now has to be cared for every second until perhaps this case goes to court, if it does. We always have to know where the evidence is. If it changed hands, who did it go to? When did that happen? We maintain a chain of custody so that evidence never disappears. And if it does, that presents problems in court, because if evidence is gone and suddenly reappears, what has happened to it while it was gone? So it's really important that a chain of custody is maintained as soon as evidence is found. And of course, another thing that an investigator can do while working the crime scene is utilize video. So using district provided equipment, that could be body cams, that could be actual cameras that the police department provides for digital recordings of crime scenes. What often will happen is they'll do it without sound being there, because there's a lot of people that could be working a crime scene at one time, and there might be things said in the background while a crime scene case is worked that may not be appropriate for court, or it could get someone into trouble. And it takes all of the subjectiveness out of what is being seen on the screen, and it's pure objective. So the jury can sit there and watch without any sound, without any interference or noise of what the investigator sees. And that crime scene is there one time in this way. As soon as the clock starts ticking after the crime scene can change. The more people that are in there, the more time that has passed. Perhaps if it's outdoors, the more weather that has got to it will degrade the crime scene with every passing hour. Another huge aspect to working a crime scene is photography. So taking photographs throughout the crime scene from various angles with high definition cameras is always going to be a key part of a crime scene. Sketching will also be a part of the report in a crime scene that happens during the second or third walkthrough. So ultimately, you are documenting again this scene as a one-time event, and you're trying to get as much of the information as you can to provide a clearer picture to eventually potentially a jury in a court case. But also still notice that nothing has been touched yet. We've talked about walking through, we've talked about taking notes, we talked about audio recordings and video recordings, and nothing is touched yet. You want to get everything exactly as it stands before anything is removed from that scene. So crime scene photography, very important aspect to working the crime scene. Again, there are pictures taken, lots and lots of pictures from every conceivable angle. You can see just on this slide alone that there are 3 different distances involved with a lot of the photographs. So we have the overview, which is kind of, the entire room scene that you see here. We see a mid-range photograph in the second picture, and in the third picture you see a close-up, which is ultimately going to be the casing here from a spent round of ammunition. So if an investigator is taking their series of photographs, they're getting not only the 3 types, but from different angles as well. If there is something that they don't have their crime scene kit available for, and it's going to be, the evidence is going to be gone in a moment, they may put something down next to the piece of evidence that is of known value. Perhaps if they have a dollar bill in their pocket, and there's a piece of evidence that's about to be degraded because of weather or perhaps traffic going through an area, they may lay it down right next to it so you get an idea of the size of that piece of evidence. So as far as the photographs are concerned, the overview shots are going to be your widest possible views of your entire scene. If your scene's indoors, it's going to include views of all the rooms in the building, not just the room where the crime seems to have occurred within. Photos are going to be taken from each corner of the room. If a boom is present, it gives them an ability to take a photo from up high. They'll use that as well, so you can kind of look down at the scene like we saw in that little digital crime scene that we looked at. Number 2, views from the outside of the building where the crime happened, including photos of all entrances and exits. Of course, if a crime is committed, that people had to get there somehow and leave somehow. So we're definitely going to want photos of those as well. Number 3, views of the building showing its relation to surrounding structures. Maybe the surrounding structures had something to do with the entry or exit of the perpetrators from that crime. So remember that, they have to get there in some way and they have to leave in some way if they have left the scene. And number 4, photos of any spectators at the scene. So sometimes people just like to gawk and like to take a look at a crime scene, and sometimes perpetrators of crimes like to return to the scene to see what's going on, because who would be crazy enough to go back to the crime scene where they just committed a crime? Well, a lot of people actually would and do that. So right here you can see there's clearly a victim on the ground face down. One of these men could definitely have been the person who caused that to happen, and by being there, maybe they're trying to convince the police that it wasn't them. It was safer to do that than try to escape. Who knows? There's a lot of different scenarios that play out, but if you have a picture of everyone there, you can also go through and take a look at some of those people if you want to further question some of them. So the last shots that you see there, of course, may provide the identity of that witness or suspect because they do return. Your mid-range photos, those are going to kind of be of the, they're not quite far away, they're not quite close up, they're somewhere in between. You're going to want to, of course, include evidence in context. So here you can see in the top left, we have the knife in the hand of the victim. There's some shoes there. There's some blood spatter around the scene. So This would be considered a mid-range. Close-up would, be the fingertips, the handle, the weapon itself. Here in this laboratory, you can see the victim. You can see a blood smear. You can see another blood pooling over here as well. The context is, they're in a scientific lab. Because wisdom tells us that, these black bench tops, these wood drawers, the fume hoods, and all those are typically present in a science lab. We would take a look and see anything else that seems perhaps as part of that crime, as well as we're trying to truly document all aspects of it. And lastly, of course, the close-up, which, if you find anything that's very beneficial to your cause, it might have some serial numbers on it or identifying characteristics that only that item has and nothing else. The CSI will have a whole camera bag full of equipment to help them, alternative lighting, tripods, different lenses, all those things are going to give the best possible views of those items. Forensics labs will then present their findings in combination with those photographs to provide the truest possible picture of what happens. CSIs take multiple sets of close-up shots. They want to use rulers, as you can see in the fingerprint photo right here as well. And here you can see the markings on, again, the bullet casing itself. You can see that pieces of evidence are numbered as they're found within a crime scene as well. Photographs are going to make it into what's known as a photo log, and that photo log can look a lot of different ways. If you were to Google photo log for crime scene, you'd find about 10 different forms of it. But ultimately, there are some things that make it onto each one. The details of the photo, each photo having a number, the description of the object or scene in the photograph, location of it, time and date the photograph was taken, and any other descriptive details that might be relevant. Again, at the crime scene, this is the one shot you have to fully document how it was when you arrived there, because as time progresses, the crime scene will deteriorate as more people work the scene. Here's another view of a photo log sheet, a little bit more detail in this one. As you can see there, take a look at some of the boxes and the labels on them, all of the detail that has to be taken down when someone's taking photographs. We also want to make sure that if you're a police officer or a crime scene investigator, that you're using department issued equipment unless it's a case of an emergency. You would never want to utilize your own for example, your own phone to take pictures, because when the defense attorney wants to see the pictures, they're gonna basically have access to your entire lot of photos on your phone, not just the evidence ones, and you want to keep your personal life private out of the crime scene. So we use department issued equipment for things like that. We also mentioned video earlier, so video walkthroughs are a thing. If there is a complicated crime scene, it may provide a true picture and feel of what the crime scene was like immediately after it happened, or whenever you came upon that crime scene. It can give the viewer a feel of how long it takes to go from one room to another, what the house or business or outdoor scene looks like at that time of day, what the lighting is like. So there's a lot of reasons why video will be beneficial. Someone might actually find something on a video that was missed during the normal walkthrough, and you could potentially rewind the video, zoom in on that thing and say, wait a second, we didn't notice this. And, during the video, it showed up. So ultimately, video can provide that extra set of eyes that if there's something that you may have missed while working that scene. And again, we mentioned earlier that it's best to keep the audio off while you do your walkthrough because of potential voices that will be in the background saying things, and sometimes those things can influence someone's mind, if someone's perhaps putting forth their theory out loud while you're working a crime scene, and that it's like a seed being planted sometimes. So we'll end our initial crime scene talk at this point. We covered the general process of working a crime scene, what's involved, and we're going to be moving through a lot of topics that are connected to this in the future. We're going to be talking about different types of evidence. We're going to be talking about sketching. But for now, we kind of have an overall feel for how a crime scene is approached and what happens in the initial steps of working that crime scene. So more to come soon. I hope you learned from this, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.